And this is Politics by Jake. Armageddon, apocalypse, the end of the world. Those are words that used to belong mostly to churches and religious texts, words that belong to prophecy and theology and sermons. But listen carefully to American politics today, and you'll notice something interesting. Those same words have started to appear more and more in political conversation, not in churches, but in politics, in foreign policy debates, in discussions about war, in commentary about the Middle East. And when that happens, it raises a question that we ought to think about very carefully. Why? Why are religious prophecies suddenly being talked about in the same breath as geopolitical strategy? Now, ordinarily, I would not spend time talking about religion on a political program like Politics by Jake. The United States was founded on a very clear principle, and that is that religious belief and civil government should remain separate. That principle was not adopted casually. The founders had studied history. They understood what had happened in Europe for centuries, virtually since the time of Constantine, when religious authority and political power were fused together. And they had seen the consequences. They were students of history. They knew that history was a cavalcade and a horror show of civil wars, persecution, political repression that was justified in the name of theology, kings claiming divine authority, churches wielding political power, and as far as these kings are concerned, often the most detestable and repugnant of characters, if that reminds you of anybody. And they decided that the new republic they were creating would avoid those traps. Thomas Jefferson spoke about what he called a wall of separation between church and state. James Madison warned that when religion and government become intertwined, both institutions are irretrievably damaged. Religion becomes politicized. Government becomes authoritarian, and the result is neither good religion nor good government. So ordinarily, I would leave religious questions entirely to theologians and clergy. But when religious movements step directly into political life and attempt to influence public policy, then those beliefs become part of the public conversation. And once they enter the arena of politics, they are no longer private matters of faith. They become political arguments. And political arguments, they deserve examination just like any other. So today, we're going to talk about a word that has begun appearing with increasing frequency in political rhetoric. And that word is Armageddon. Now, most people who hear that word assume it refers to some supernatural catastrophe. There was a movie made about it, some cosmic event where the world ends in fire and brimstone and destruction with weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. But that's not actually where the word comes from. And it would probably be instructive to my listening and viewing audience to just talk about that for a minute. The word Armageddon is derived from the Hebrew phrase Har Megiddo, and that means the Hill of Megiddo. And Megiddo is a real place. It sits in northern Israel at one of the most strategically important crossroads in the ancient world. For thousands of years, armies marched through that region. The Egyptians fought there. The Assyrians fought there. The Babylonians fought there. The Romans fought there. It was one of those places where geography and power intersect. And the concept was control Megiddo, and you controlled the trade routes between Africa, Asia, and Europe. That's quite something in any age. Lose it, and you lost access to those routes. So battles were fought there again and again across centuries. By the time the book of Revelation was written, Megiddo had already become a symbol of great powers colliding, a symbol of decisive conflict, a symbol of history reaching a dramatic turning point. But here is something many people do not realize. The word apocalypse does not actually mean destruction. In Greek, the word apocalypse means revelation. It means an unveiling, an unfolding, like the removal of a curtain. The moment when hidden truths become visible. So originally, these words were not describing some mystical explosion at the end of time. They were describing something far more familiar. Human conflict, human ambition, empires colliding with one another, history reaching moments where the true nature of power becomes visible to everyone. And that brings us back to our present moment. Because when modern politicians begin talking about Armageddon, the question we should ask is not whether prophecy is being fulfilled. The question we should ask is something much simpler. Who is it exactly who benefits from using this kind of language? Who benefits from the idea that war in the Middle East is inevitable? Who benefits from the belief that global conflict is somehow a part of a divine plan? History tells us this, that when leaders begin framing political events as destiny rather than choice, something dangerous is happening. Because if events are destiny, then no one is responsible. If war is prophecy, then no one has to prevent it. No one can prevent it. If conflict is part of a divine script, then human beings no longer have agency. And that's a very convenient narrative for people who wish to exercise power without accountability. But history suggests something else entirely, actually. History suggests, rather, that most catastrophes are not acts of God. They are acts of human beings, acts of ambition, acts of miscalculation, acts of ideology overriding judgment. And when that happens, well, the results are rarely good. So before we accept grand rhetoric about Armageddon and destiny, please, it might be useful to remember something. The Hill of Megiddo was not originally a symbol of prophecy. It was a symbol of strategy. It was a place where armies fought because geography made it important. It was a place where decisions made by rulers and generals determined the fate of thousands of people. In other words, it was a place where politics and power intersected. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because the world we live in today is still shaped by those very same forces: power, strategy, ambition, and the decisions of human beings. We'll take a short break. And when we come back, we'll talk about how religious prophecy became entangled with modern political movements and why that matters for American foreign policy today. Stay with us. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake. This is the Saturday show. And we are back. Okay. When we left off, we were talking about the word Armageddon and where it actually comes from. And we discovered that it doesn't come from it's not prophecy. It's geography. The Hill of Megiddo, a strategic crossroads where armies fought for centuries. And they did so because control of that terrain meant control of trade routes, power, and influence. But somewhere along the way, that historical symbol became something else. It became part of a religious narrative about the end of history. Now, there's nothing unusual about religious traditions having visions about the end of the world. Every civilization has had them. Ancient cultures imagined cycles of destruction and renewal. Norse mythology talked about, and I love this word in particular, Ragnarok. What a great word. So Norse mythology spoke about that. Many traditions spoke about ages rising and falling. It's a very popular theme in comic books and what are known as graphic novels, which are comic books today. But the interesting thing about American politics is not that these ideas exist. The interesting thing is that some political movements believe that those ideas should influence policy decisions. And that, well, that's where things start getting complicated. Because once prophecy becomes a factor in political thinking, you introduce something into public policy that cannot be debated rationally. I mean, look, if someone believes a war must happen because prophecy, or more likely, their interpretation of prophecy, which is just hugely problematic, says it will happen, then diplomacy, it becomes irrelevant because you're barreling towards it no matter what. Nobody can do anything. If someone believes that a geopolitical conflict is part of a divine plan, that preventing that conflict may even appear to be interfering with God's will. And once that mindset enters politics, you have crossed from strategy into ideology. And honestly, may I say, once that mindset enters politics, you have crossed from strategy into crazy land and crazy talk. Now, historically, American foreign policy was not built on prophecy. It was built on interests, economic interests, strategic interests, security interests. The founders of the United States were remarkably pragmatic about this. They believed that the country should avoid foreign entanglements unless their national security required it. They believed that alliances should be approached carefully, and they believed that wars should be avoided whenever possible. Because wars have a way of producing consequences that leaders never seem to anticipate. Again, does it remind you of anything? That was the traditional framework. But over the past several decades, something new has appeared in American political discourse. You hear politicians and commentators speaking about global events as if they are chapters in a prophetic script. You hear references to biblical battles. You hear references to end time scenarios. You hear references to inevitable conflicts in the Middle East, and those references are not always metaphorical. In some cases, the people making them mean them quite literally. They believe history is moving towards a predetermined conclusion. Now, when beliefs like that exist purely within religious communities, they're a part of private faith. Let's be clear. You can believe in anything you want to believe in this country. That's one of the great things. But when those beliefs begin influencing government decisions, and I might remind you at this point of this biblical injunction that reminds us that we have not come to what that particular scripture refers to as a unity of the faith. No, not by any means. So when those beliefs begin influencing government decisions, then they become something else. They become a part of public policy. And public policy, it affects millions of people who may not believe the same way at all. Now, to understand how that shift happens, you have to look at something that occurred inside American political movements over the past 40 or 50 years. Religious activism has begun or began at that time merging with political activism. Church organizations became political organizations. Political campaigns began appealing to religious identity. Why? They want to get money. They want to get elected. And gradually, the line that once separated theological belief from policy debate, it became less distinct. Now again, people are free to believe whatever they wish in matters of faith, and God bless America. That freedom, that is protected by the Constitution. But the Constitution also created something else. It created a system where government decisions are supposed to be made through reasoned debate. The age in which the Constitution came forth is sometimes called the age of reason. And it is not called that for nothing. So, reasoned debate, evidence, argument, accountability. The problem arises when leaders begin treating political questions as theological questions, because theology cannot be resolved by debate. It is a question of belief, and not everybody believes the same. It'd be great, but it's not happening. Belief is not subject to the same kind of scrutiny that public policy requires. So when we hear political rhetoric that sounds like a prophecy, it is worth pausing for a moment and asking a simple question. Is this language describing reality? Or is it shaping reality? Because words have power. The language that leaders use influences the way people think about events. If you describe a geopolitical conflict as a strategic challenge, people think about diplomacy and negotiation. If you describe it as destiny, people begin to believe it cannot be avoided and that they are steamrolling and barreling towards it, irretrievably and unavoidably. And that distinction, that matters. Now, history shows us that wars often become inevitable only after people begin speaking about them as inevitable. Once that idea enters the public imagination, it becomes self-fulfilling. Leaders prepare for war. Populations expect war. Diplomacy becomes secondary. And before long, the conflict everyone predicted finally arrives. Oh, gee, what a surprise. But prediction did not cause it. Human decisions did. Now, this is where a certain amount of historical perspective can be helpful. The world has heard predictions about Armageddon many times before. People predicted it during the fall of the Roman Empire. People predicted it during the Black Death. People predicted it during the world wars of the 20th century. And yet history continued. Civilizations changed. Empires rose. Empires fell. But the world did not end. What did happen, however, is that people who believed catastrophic conflict was inevitable sometimes acted in ways that made conflict more likely. And that brings us back to the present moment, because when prophecy language enters political discourse, we should remember that it is not prophecy shaping events, it is people. People with power. People with influence. People making decisions. And those decisions still matter. Now we'll take another short break, and when we return, we'll look at how geopolitical realities in the Middle East intersect with these narratives, and why the situation is far more complicated than prophecy or ideology might suggest. Stay with us. This is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. This is Politics by Jake, and we're back. When we left off, we were talking about how prophecy language has gradually entered into political discourse. But we also talked about how that the real world does not operate according to prophecy, or it shouldn't. And there are reasons for this. We don't all believe the same. It's problematic to impose one religious belief upon everybody, the world being so diverse and so full of variety it is. The real world operates according to power, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the geopolitics of the Middle East. Now, the Middle East has been one of the most strategically important regions on Earth for centuries. Why? Because it sits at the intersection of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. It sits astride major trade routes. It contains some of the world's most important energy reserves. And it sits near some of the most critical maritime choke points in the global economy. So when great powers become interested in that region, it has very little to do with prophecy. No, it has to do with strategy. It has to do with control of energy resources. It has to do with control of transportation corridors, like the Straits of Hormuz, for example. It has to do with influence over regional alliances. Those are the real drivers of geopolitical decision making. But if you listen to some political rhetoric today, you would think that these conflicts are unfolding according to some kind of pre-written script by some kind of angry God, as if the actors involved have no agency, as if events are simply unfolding because they must unfold. History tells us something very different about this. History tells us that conflicts emerge because human beings make choices. Megiddo has been a place that has been fought at over the centuries by many factions. Was that all as a result of prophecy? No. As I said, history tells us the conflicts emerge because human beings make choices. Choices based on interests. Choices based on ideology. Choices based on perceived threats and opportunities. And sometimes choices based on miscalculation. Now, consider, if you will, the Middle East as it exists today. It is a region with overlapping rivalries. There are national rivalries. There are sectarian rivalries. There are economic rivalries. There are great power rivalries. And each of those layers interacts with the others. Iran has its interests. Israel has its interests. Saudi Arabia has its interests. Turkey has its interests. Russia has its interests. NATO and the EU have their interests. The United States has its interests. The other Gulf nations have their interests, and none of those interests are necessarily identical. None. Each actor is pursuing security, influence, and survival according to its own strategic calculation. Now, when analysts study this region seriously, they don't talk about prophecy. They talk about deterrence. They talk about the balance of power. They talk about alliances and rivalries because those are the forces that actually shape outcomes. But when the language of prophecy enters a conversation, something truly dangerous can happen. Political conflicts begin to be framed as moral absolutes. Compromise becomes betrayal. Diplomacy becomes weakness. And complex geopolitical realities become simplified into narratives of good versus evil. Well, you know, that kind of framing, that may be emotionally satisfying, but it rarely produces good policy. Real diplomacy requires something much less dramatic. It requires patience. It requires compromise. It requires acknowledging that other nations also have interests that they will defend. And sometimes it requires accepting imperfect solutions in order to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Again, does this remind you of anything that may be happening right now? But when political leaders begin speaking in apocalyptic terms, that kind of pragmatic thinking becomes harder because apocalyptic thinking tends to eliminate the middle ground. Everything becomes final. Everything becomes decisive. Everything becomes a battle between absolute forces, and that mindset, that's not particularly helpful when dealing with nuclear powers, regional alliances, and fragile geopolitical balances that have been going on for decades or even hundreds of years. So, look, the reality of this is that the Middle East today is not a stage for prophecy. No, 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 no. It is a complex geopolitical system with multiple actors pursuing their own survival and their own influence. Understanding that complexity, this is essential if policymakers hope to prevent escalation rather than accelerate it. And history shows that escalation often begins not with weapons, but with rhetoric. Words shape expectations. Expectations shape decisions. Decisions shape events. So when we hear leaders or commentators speaking casually about inevitable wars or prophetic conflicts, it is worth remembering something simple. Wars are not inevitable. They are the result of human decisions. And human decisions can also prevent them. And let's take another break. When we come back, we'll talk about something that provides a very simple test for political movements, religious movements, and governments alike. It's a test that's surprisingly old and surprisingly effective. Stay with us. And this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we are back. Welcome. When we left off, we were talking about the difference between prophecy and politics. And we said that prophecy speaks this language of inevitability, and that politics, on the other hand, is supposed to operate in the language of choice. And believe me, that distinction matters, because if people begin to believe that conflict is inevitable, they'll behave quite differently than if they believe conflict can be avoided. If people believe history is following a script, well, then human responsibility goes right out the window. It disappears. But if history is shaped by human decisions, then responsibility remains exactly where it belongs, with the people making those decisions. Now, look, there is a very old standard that can help us evaluate political movements and leaders. It does not come from modern political science. It does not come from international relations theory. It comes from a much older source. The phrase appears in the New Testament. You've probably heard it before. By your fruits ye shall know them. Now, that is an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because it contains a very simple idea. You do not judge a person by their claims. You do not judge a movement by its rhetoric. You judge them by what you see happen. You judge them by their results. You judge them by the fruits that they produce. In other words, hey, outcomes matter. And that principle, it applies just as easily to politics as it does to theology. If a political movement produces stability, prosperity, and peace, those are good fruits. So that must be a good political movement. If, on the other hand, a movement produces division, chaos, strife, conflict, then those fruits speak for themselves, don't they? Again, what does this remind you of that's going on right now? But getting back to what we're talking about, it's really that simple. Now, that standard, it has an advantage that modern political debate often lacks. It cuts through slogans. It cuts through ideology. And it cuts through propaganda, because results can't be hidden forever. Policies eventually produce consequences. Wars produce consequences. Economic decisions produce consequences, and history ultimately records those consequences, whether leaders like it or not. Now, if we apply that standard to the political environment we are living in today, we see something interesting. We see a world in which rhetoric has become increasingly dramatic, increasingly absolute, increasingly apocalyptic. But rhetoric does not determine reality. Reality is determined by outcomes. If leaders pursue policies that escalate conflict, then the fruits will be conflict. They will be misery, they will be sorrow, they will be strife. If leaders pursue policies that destabilize alliances, then the fruits will be instability. And if leaders treat geopolitical crises as opportunities for ideological crusades that only a limited amount of the population may actually believe in, rather than strategic problems to be solved for the benefit of everyone, then the fruits will reflect that as well. History has seen many movements that believed themselves to be righteous, many movements that believed that they were advancing destinies, many leaders who believed that they were the instrument in some God's hand of some larger historical force. But history judges those movements by what they actually produced. The Roman emperors, of course, they believed they were gods. And they preserved that as gods, they were preserving civilization. The medieval crusaders believed that they were carrying out divine missions. The ideologues of the 20th century believed that they were building perfect societies, but the outcomes of those movements tell them a different story, often a much different story. And that is the power of the standard we just mentioned. Namely, by your fruits ye shall know them, not by their speeches, not by their slogans, not by their claims of righteousness, but by the consequences of their actions. Now, that standard applies not only to political movements, but also to political rhetoric, because language shapes behavior. And when leaders use language that inflames division, the fruits are division. When leaders use language that encourage confrontation, the fruits are confrontation. And when leaders frame global politics as a battle between absolute forces of good and evil, maybe like Yahweh and whoever, the fruits tend to be conflict rather than compromise. That does not mean that moral judgment has no place in politics. Of course it does. Of course it does. But moral judgment should be informed by wisdom and humility, not by ideological certainty. Because ideological certainty, well, my friends, that is will-o'-the-wisp. Truly will-o'-the-wisp. The founders of the United States understood something about human nature that modern politics sometimes forgets. They understood that power must be restrained. They understood that institutions must be designed to prevent the concentration of authority in any one place. And they understood that political systems must leave room for disagreement, for compromise, and for correction. And why? Because human beings are fallible. Oh, so fallible. Leaders are fallible. Oh, so fallible. Movements, also fallible. And the moment any political movement begins to believe that it possesses absolute truth, the danger of abuse increases dramatically. That is why the American system was designed to balance competing interests. It was designed to prevent any single faction from imposing its will without restraint. And it was designed to encourage debate rather than certainty. Now, in recent years, we have seen increasing pressure on that system. Political rhetoric has become sharper. Political divisions have become deeper. And the temptation to frame political conflicts as existential struggles has grown stronger. But history reminds us that political systems survive not because leaders claim righteousness. No, they survive because institutions remain strong and citizens remain thoughtful, because ultimately the health of a republic depends not only on its leaders, but on the judgment of its people. And that brings us back to the phrase we mentioned earlier: by their fruits you shall know them. That phrase invites us to evaluate political movements calmly and carefully, not according to their claims, but according to their outcomes. Are policies producing stability or instability? Are leaders encouraging wisdom or encouraging division? Are governments exercising power responsibly or irresponsibly? See, those are the questions that every citizen must answer for themselves, because a republic ultimately belongs to the people who sustain it. And history has shown again and again and again that republics survive only when the citizens remain engaged, informed, and thoughtful. Now, earlier in the program, we spoke about the word Armageddon, the Hill of Megiddo, a place where great armies once clashed, many times where great armies clashed. But history teaches us that most of the catastrophes people feared were not predetermined. They were the result of human choices. And that means something really important. It means that the future is not written. It is shaped. Shaped by decisions, shaped by judgment, shaped by the willingness of people to question rhetoric and examine reality. So, when we hear dramatic language about destiny or apocalypse in modern political discourse, perhaps the wisest response is not panic, but perspective, because history has survived many dramatic moments before. Empires have risen. Empires have fallen. Wars have been fought. Wars have been ended. And yet, the world continues. What matters most is not prophecy. What matters most is responsibility. Responsibility exercised by leaders. Responsibility exercised by citizens. And responsibility exercised by institutions designed to preserve liberty. Because ultimately, the strength of a republic does not depend on prophecy. It depends on wisdom, and wisdom requires something that is sometimes in short supply in modern politics: patience, restraint, and the willingness to judge ideas not by their rhetoric, but by their results, by their fruits. And this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. There's something else worth remembering before we close tonight. A republic does not collapse all at once. It doesn't fall in a single dramatic moment. When the Roman Empire supposedly fell, or even when the Roman Republic fell, nobody really noticed it and would say, hey, the Roman Republic just was replaced with an empire right there. See that? Or, hey, the Roman Empire just fell. Look at that. As if it was something on a sports show. No, it erodes slowly, piece by piece, norm by norm, truth by truth. And the danger is that people grow accustomed to it. They grow accustomed to the noise, the outrage, the cruelty, the spectacle. And after a while, it begins to feel normal. But it isn't normal. A healthy republic is supposed to be governed by laws, by restraint, by institutions that check power rather than amplify it. And when those restraints begin to fail, when cruelty becomes a political tool, when truth becomes optional, when power is exercised simply because it can be exercised by someone who says, Article 2 says I can do anything. Does that remind you of anybody? Well, when that happens, then we are no longer talking about politics. We're talking about something much deeper than that. So the real question is not, as you've probably gleaned and derived by now, what Donald Trump believes he can do according to Article 2. The real question is this: what the American people are willing to tolerate. Because in the end, the character of a nation is revealed the same way the character of a man is revealed, by what it produces, by what it rewards, by what it permits. And as the old line reminds us, by their fruits ye shall know them. And that's all for today. This is Politics by Jake.